figure out how to use it? Did you hear that all right? Oh, all right. You can help me figure it out. So, sorry, but you have to deal with me again. Bill, I want to burn your power line right of ways. Let's talk later. So a prescribed fire, thankfully, is not as uncommon as it once was, but a definite wrinkle in the whole scheme is when you regularly have thousands of cars drive through your burn unit. So I've been working on fire at the Minnesota Department of Transportation for a little over 10 years now, and I just want to share with you a little bit about what we're doing with fire, how we're using it, what are some of the obstacles we have been facing, and how we're trying to overcome them. So Minnesota, for those of you who aren't familiar, about 2/3 of Minnesota has native plant communities that include fire-dependent vegetation. We have 12,000 miles of state and federal highways, which amounts to about 175,000 acres of roadside, and we're burning some of them. That is outside of that purple area. That area is more of a conifer forest, and so although we do have some roadsides planted with prairie species there, they don't really belong. They do well, but we're not going to burn them just because it would be too difficult to deal with the fire there. So we are using fire on roadside prairie remnants. We're doing some on wetland mitigations. That's kind of how it started out, but we've moved more into roadsides. Probably the vast majority is our planted roadsides. Those remnants are our highest priority. If we have those and we can burn them, those are our first choice. We have enough of a history of herbicides mixing with federally protected plant species that we have people in maintenance that are more than happy to see us burn them, so they have an excuse not to have to go control weeds and brush out there with mowing or herbicide. But still, probably the vast majority are roadsides that we planted with natives. We try to burn in areas where it's simple. You can see beyond the right-of-way here is just row crop field. This is bean stubble. We have enough area that could use fire that we're able to be kind of choosy and pick the areas that are easier so we can be a little more productive and have to pay less attention to controlling the fire and a little more attention to the smoke management. So we're using established standards. MnDOT had a history of using fire back in the 80s and 90s and about a 10-year break until they hired me, and one of the things they wanted me to do was start up their fire program again. And when we did start it, we decided to follow some established standards. So we follow what the Minnesota DNR uses, which is kind of like the National Wildfire Coordinating Group standards, the same standards that you see on any federal wildfire. But at the higher qualification levels with prescribed fire, the qualifications are a little bit easier. They have less of the wildfire requirements in them, more geared toward prescribed fire. There have been a fair amount of arguments over whether that's the right approach. You can see we have the same PPE as any wildland firefighter would have. We even have shelters, even though our roadside fires are pretty small. There are plenty of safety zones. It's not very likely that you'd have to shelter in place on a prescribed fire on a roadside. But I've gone over this with crew members all the time. They always complain about it. And, we talk about how there have been situations in grassland fires where shelters are used maybe as a shield to walk through something. You never know. But ultimately, this standard, what this did for us is starting up using fire in an extremely high-profile situation. It kind of gave us instant credibility. We weren't out there doing our own thing, not knowing what we were doing. We were using the same standards as anyone else in the state. We stressed the need to have a highly trained professional operation out there because of the risks involved and because of how high profile it is. And what those standards also did for us is it made it easy right away to collaborate with the other prescribed fire practitioners in the state. So we worked a lot with the DNR on training and task books, certification for qualifications, etc. The other thing that I get to complain about is those high visibility safety vests. So a lot of those, as you probably know, are plasticky material, very melty. This particular one is cotton, so it's less flammable, but not everyone has those. And so our crew members will complain about having to wear those melty fire vests over their expensive fire-resistant fire shirt, and I still tell them that they're still a lot more likely to get hit by a car out there than burned by one of our fires. So They look at me like I'm crazy and they get back to work. It's true. It's kind of scary out there with those cars. So our equipment, we have some of the same ATVs that you're used to seeing on any prescribed fire crew. We also have some equipment you're not used to seeing. So this is a plow truck with a water tank used for street sweeping or flushing bridges. We also have trucks that look like this that are used for herbicides. And they make do for a little makeshift grass rig. We make it work. I haven't convinced anyone to buy a full-scale professional grass rig yet. Planning, along with those standards that we talked about, are lots of planning. So while fires like this might be very satisfying to pull off, they don't come easy. There's a ton of planning that goes into it. Our burn plans, don't try to read this, just see that our planning is extensive. This is probably a 20-page burn plan. They look a lot more like plans that a federal agency would use rather than our 4-page state DNR burn plans. This particular plan covers over 20 miles of highway. I try to write plans to cover a big area, so if I'm going to put the effort into writing that plan, it's going to be useful for a long time to cover a lot of ground. I don't have to redo it very often. These plans are reviewed by other fire professionals, some within our department and some with partner agencies. They're reviewed and signed by our maintenance superintendents. They're the ones that are footing the bill for this, putting their crews out there. So I want to make sure they know what they're getting into. And they're also reviewed and signed by our traffic engineers so that they see what we're doing and they can be assured that the traffic control layouts that they're recommending make sense for the work. So regarding traffic control, it's unavoidable. We've never been allowed to detour traffic for the purpose of a prescribed burn. Heck, they almost never let us detour for road construction anymore. Hang on, check my notes. So it's really expensive. We have to be able to stop traffic. So if it's a undivided highway, we have to have the ability to flag traffic to stop it. If it's a divided highway, we have to have the ability to stop the 2 lanes of traffic on the side that we're burning. So that means on a typical roadside burn, we can pull that off with 5 or 6 firefighters. But then on the divided, we might need 2 additional people for flaggers or 3 additional people to drive these 3 trucks, these crash trucks. So that's doubling our crew right there. Our costs, these roadside burns are expensive. It costs, on average, $3,000 for a day of burning, and about a third of that cost is traffic control. And that used to really rub me the wrong way, but as I've been out there more and more, I now think it would be really irresponsible not to. It's actually really comforting to know that we have the ability to give our crew some more protection on the highway, that we have the ability to give the public a little more protection. The thing is, I always have to be stressing to our crews that traffic control isn't there so that we can burn under riskier conditions. It's there still as a backup. So we've had cases where smoke might come over the road just for a little bit. It feels like many minutes, but when I look back at my photos and the timestamps, it's just a few seconds. But we've had that, and we've put the traffic control up. We've had the flaggers stop traffic or had those trucks pull into place to close the lane. If that happens more than once, we seriously consider whether we should still be burning that day on that site. If it happens more than once, we're definitely quitting or moving on to an easier, safer place. So we take it pretty seriously. And it allows us to burn in situations where other people couldn't. So on this highway overpass, we had the crash trucks doing traffic control on the main line, and we had flaggers up on the crossroad controlling traffic there. It allowed us to burn some wide medians, which is really gratifying because those can be some of the most visible places that people see afterwards. It takes a lot of coordination. I described the coordination with the Department of Natural Resources earlier with the training and qualifications, the certification. They've also given us a lot of help, just advice with equipment and whatnot. There's a lot of coordination with the railroads. We coordinate with 3 or 4 different railroad companies around the state to get permission to burn onto their right-of-way, because where we have those prairie remnants, which I said were our highest profile, usually it's owned in part by the railroads, so we get permission to be out there. Bill, like I said, I need to coordinate more on power lines. We had some high voltage transmission lines recently go up right where we have been burning, and in some other places where we were planning on burning. I think I could pull it off, but I've got some convincing to do, so I need to talk to some people to either educate me or give me a reality check or both. We also coordinate with local road authorities, of course. Here's a burn where the right side is our state highway, and on the left side, that's a local township road, so we had to get permission there to use traffic control on their road. The messaging has always been important. I've always felt from the beginning that we need to tell our story before other people start telling it for us. And that's included a lot of both internal and external outreach, but internally convincing our DOT administration about the importance. I really fall back on the messaging I use for vegetation management in general, and that is just that roadside is not there as extra space. It's a critical part of our highway infrastructure. That roadside vegetation has to serve a lot of functions. As you all know, it has to give us a safety zone, clear zones, sometimes blowing snow control, has to give us correct drainage and erosion control. In Minnesota, the land of 10,000 lakes, it needs to give us really good stormwater treatment so we can keep our surface waters clean. It needs to be healthy enough to resist invasive species invasion and spread. All the vegetation management reasons. With native vegetation, we feel like we can get more function out of that. We can do serve those critical functions a lot better with native vegetation, and if it's healthy, so fire is one of the tools to keep it healthy. Notice that I didn't say anything in my internal pitch to the DOT about habitat or aesthetics, because that's not why we're doing it as far as they're concerned. Iowa is lucky enough to have something in statute saying that those other benefits are a part of the transportation function. Minnesota doesn't have that, so to avoid the question, well, that's not our job, I sometimes just leave it out, or I use it as secondary benefits. So if we're doing all these primary functions well, the vegetation is healthy enough to do those, then we can also have the aesthetics, which is really important in a state with as much tourism as Minnesota. We can also have the wildlife, the habitat, and the invasive species control, which is also important in a state with as much outdoor recreation and tourism as well, and agriculture too, as Minnesota has. So we use it as one of several important tools. How am I doing on time? Okay. I'm going to skip that. We can get to it with questions if anyone's curious or afterward. But I want to go over just some of the obstacles. So one of the obstacles is very apparent right here in this picture. If you can read between the lines, this is a burn on land that's owned in part by the railroad and in part by the highway department. And you can see that all of the roadside right-of-way has been mowed. So just that internal coordination sometimes to make sure the people in maintenance doing the mowing know that we need to leave it unmowed so we can burn it next spring. Even those simple things are often difficult at a big agency. Other obstacles have been just that vegetation management is a low priority. As Joel said earlier, the priority goes from the center line out, and that includes any kind of vegetation management, including fire. So we've had a hard time, we kind of started out where we had supervisors a little reluctant to send their employees out to do what, and we wanted to get some fire on the ground so they could see the results, but we couldn't get a lot of fire on the ground unless we got them out enough to where they were well-versed and experienced and efficient. Once they became efficient, we could show them a lot. We could show their supervisors a lot of production, but that was hard at first. Those standards I referred to early on, those qualification standards, for the basic wildland firefighters, it's a week of training or an online class. I thought that would be a big hurdle, but supervisors were surprisingly willing to let some folks go take that training. But to be qualified as a burn boss, we look for a burn boss to lead our moderate complexity burns, and that can easily take 10 years. And so that left us in a position where for a while I was the only burn boss in the department trying to keep 4 crews busy all across the state. And so we had that production problem and the experience problem. Sometimes crews were only getting out once a year, and it's hard to become very proficient that way. We're limited by burn plans. It takes a lot of planning to put that burn plan together, and if we don't have a roadside that has that signed burn plan, we can't burn it. So there would be plenty of days where it's good fire weather, but the wind is in the wrong direction for the roadsides that we have planned. So, and then just also being able to show results to an audience within our department who's not familiar with vegetation and don't necessarily know what they're supposed to be seeing, what they're supposed to be looking for. So all of this is all kind of problems that pointed towards some kind of a jump start, where we needed to get more qualifications, more experience, more burning done so that we could get over this hurdle. And so we're accomplishing that with help from the Environment and Natural Resources Trust Fund. That's a fund in Minnesota that goes toward various conservation and natural resources projects. It's funded by proceeds from our state lottery. And I was able to get money from them to hire a full-time burn boss, so I was only able to put maybe 20% of my time toward it. And now we have a full-time person who in the spring and fall is doing nothing but burning with our crews. In the winter, he is writing burn plans, making sure we're taking any opportunity we can to take available training so our crew members can become more qualified, and in general getting things ready. And in the summer when we're not burning, he's out there mapping native vegetation on roadsides and also setting up a quantitative fire effects monitoring program. So we're getting the qualifications addressed with more experience. We're showing people more of what we can do. We're getting more plans ready so we have more areas that we can burn. And it's resulted in last year, this is February 1st was the first full year of his term, and 2018 was our most productive burn season since I've been keeping track. We had 28 burns done, 28 miles, 21 burns in 2018, 28 miles of roadside, plus 4 different wetland mitigation sites. We've got one person who's qualified as a burn boss 3, which is good for the low complexity burns. He needs just a little more work. And 6 other people who are in progress in the process of becoming qualified as burn bosses. So the goal is for us to get to 3. I want 3 self-sufficient burn crews, so that when we lose our full-time, our funding for a full-time position, we can drop back to a half-time FTE supporting the fire program, supporting those districts, getting them the resources they need, and also trying to maintain a culture of following those standards and a culture of high reliability, so that when they're doing this work in this really risky and high-profile environment, we are very safe and very professional, yet effective at our vegetation management. Do we have time for any questions? Yeah. Yeah.
Have you had scenarios where you have imperiled pollinators in areas that you're thinking about burning? And if so, how did you adjust for that, or how would you do that in the future?
Where we've imperiled the pollinators, or where imperiled pollinators are there?
Where imperiled pollinators are there. And then tell me if you think you might be imperiling.
I don't know of any sites where there are known occurrences. We started surveying for rusty badge bumblebees recently, and I don't know that we have not burned any sites where there are known occurrences there. There aren't any more Dakota skippers left on our right-of-way, so we don't have that. We do have, a lot of you might know Chris Smith, our biologist, and he has a lot of background in entomology too. So he's keeping an eye on me. And we're part of that fire effects monitoring. We'll be trying to look at, just trying to quantify what effects are we really having, and what do we need? Do we need to be changing anything relative to refugia, and making sure we have the right amount of leaf litter and the right habitat matrix, because as he would gladly point out, he doesn't like to be asked, is this good for pollinators? Because pollinators is a pretty big topic, and any conditions are going to be good for some things and not for others. So we're trying to figure out what kind of a return interval and what kind of a patchiness do we need to have out there to make sure that we're protecting the insects too.
What kind of interaction do you have with local fire departments to complete your burn?
So some of them don't pay a lot of attention. Sometimes we coordinate really closely and we ask them what kind of equipment they have on hand, and we make sure that that's there before we start our burn, kind of as our contingency resources. They're usually not the ones permitting our burns. Usually that's the Department of Natural Resources, so they're not involved in that way. So it ranges anywhere from just a friendly notification, hey, we're burning today, to somewhere in the middle where we might ask to borrow a drip torch. And then they don't want to send it to us until they see our equipment, and they think, oh, well, they must know what they were doing. To more involved, where we make sure that they have their grass rig and their ATV in the shop that day, and it hasn't been called out, or else we're not burning. So, yeah. In this kind of a situation, no, we haven't. The ones I'm thinking of are where some really high voltage lines went in. I think I could pull it off, but I think I should probably convince them first.
You can come talk to me.
All right, let's talk. Good. Am I out of time, Claudia? Or okay. Thanks a lot.